Doooovid here. We are live. Very excited to have Lipton Matthews of the Mises Institute. Oswald from my Discord shared his YouTube page with me about a month ago. And, actually, Kevin McDonald, the people who found me interested in his books on Jewish evolutionary group strategy. So that was the video he shared with me. And then I saw you had a bunch of stuff on IQ and culture and worked at the Mises Institute. And I've been watching your videos basically ever since for about a month now, and even went back and watched quite a few of your previous videos. And I tweeted out to you because you had all these videos on intelligence and IQ about chunking theory. I have a regular week in review, and my own theories on intelligence, specifically related to chunking theory. And I guess you had a little familiarity with the topic. Maybe we'll talk about that later. And just to mention, my brother is a huge fan of the Mises Institute and Lou Rockwell. And I have libertarian leanings. I'm officially registered. I only voted when I turned 18. I registered as a libertarian and voted straight libertarian. That's the only time I voted. I'm not sure if we'll get into kind of like the breakout of the Austrian school and the Mises Institute in the various views, and maybe it's related to group strategy that we hope to talk about. So, very excited and great privilege to have Mr. Matthews here. I'll let him open with whatever biographical information he wants to share, and then hopefully he'll give a little breakdown on his economic view. And he wanted to talk about gender quotas in Africa, and then we'll move into IQ. And just to mention, also was interesting because I've been coaching chess here in Metro Detroit for almost a decade. The vast majority of my students are African American, and we use chess as a method largely to help them improve thinking skills, mostly related to math and science. I also thought some of his views might be interesting on that. So please, I give you Lipton Matthews.
All right. Hello. Good morning. So I am a contributor to the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute was founded in 1982 by Lou Rockwell, Murray Rothbard, and Burton Blumert, etc. So I am not a fellow at the Mises Institute. I am one of their contributors. I write on culture, economics, Africa, and global development. And for those of you who are wondering, what is the Mises Institute? The Mises Institute is influenced by Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig von Mises was a distinguished 20th century economist. He wrote Human Action. He wrote on relativism and science, methodological individualism. Now, what's the difference between the Austrian school and other schools? Let me be as simple as I possibly can. Austrian economics believes in mathematics. Economics is a quantitative field. It's big on data, research, and analysis. The Austrians are not saying that we're opposed to mathematics, but we believe that economics is influenced by human nature and human preference. In other words, the subjective value of theory. So a product is valuable because of how it's viewed relative to another product, or its ability to meet demand in a particular time frame. But I'm just touching the surface here. But I just felt that I had to debunk the notion that the Austrian schools is anti-mathematics. We're not anti-mathematics. We're rational, and we're more deductive than inductive. So in deductive method, you reason and analyze data, and then you may be guided to do further research. But the inductive school is more empirical. They're only driven by their research findings. We're more logical. We believe in the logical analysis of data and economics. In other words, we take the individual seriously.
In relation to libertarian thought, and I guess I have more mathematical background, but from a people who don't have such a background in economics, if you're talking the logical actor theory, you're assuming that most people act in a logical or self-interest way, and then the question of how do you define that logical self-interest that people act, or then even in terms of acting in groups. I'm not sure if that's one of the disagreements about group actors.
And and you also need to mention preferences, because human preferences are not always rational. So the Mizians are saying, please take the individual and his worldview seriously. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm not that much into
Yeah.
economics, but I know your
You're
background
big
is.
on evolution. You're big on evolutionary theory and group strategy dynamics. So I guess at some point you can merge the two fields.
Well, I'm actually more a spiritualist and believer in the soul. And when we get to intelligence, we'll talk about that because I think intelligence is actually a function of the soul, not a body. But I do believe in group action, and then from a mystical level, if what causes people to act as groups. So it's just evolutionary psychology talks about people acting in groups. Although I largely agree with their conclusion, but personally, I think the cause of that is some spiritual phenomenon as opposed to a physical phenomenon. And I think your background maybe is even
So
evangelical Christianity.
I'm a Protestant.
Yes, I don't. I mean, we could talk about the other issues first if you want to talk about Africa and gender quotas. But I did want to talk to you about when we get to talking about intelligence and the nature of the soul, or if you want to go into some of your beliefs, and even in terms of group actors. Maybe if you've talked quite a bit about cold winter theory, which is one of the issues I've talked about. And a lot of times I talk with a lot of atheists, Professor Dutton, and some of the same personalities you've talked with, and I'm capable of putting similar ideas in different terms. That as a spiritualist, that versus evolutionist, if we're largely referring to the same concept but just have a different cause.
Yeah, but before we digress, I must also state that another difference between the Mises Institute and other think tanks is that the Mises Institute is also heavily influenced by Murray Rothbard, and Murray Rothbard was anti-state. So the Misesians want a decentralized society. They tend towards anarcho-capitalism, whereas other libertarians are more classical liberals. They view the state as a necessary evil that is required to preserve property rights and protect human rights more broadly, whereas the Misesians argue that society can be organized spontaneously, and in most cases the state is actually an impediment. So it's not unusual for Misesians to argue that probably we don't need a police force, and the law system should be privatized, etc. So the Mises Institute is really big on privatizations. I even interviewed Walter Block, who believes that we should privatize everything, even the roads and the oceans. So this is another difference between the Misesians and other libertarians. The Misesians are more radical, and another this difference again is that though Misesians are libertarian, they tend to lean towards some conservative policies. So, for example, Murray Rothbard wrote widely on race, intelligence, culture, and yet despite promoting libertarian philosophies as an individual, Rothbard was very conservative. So the average Misesian, even if he's arguing for gay marriage, this is not an issue that he feels strongly about.
Yeah, and I'm here in Metro Detroit, which is largely an African American run city. I mean, currently we have one of the first blue-eyed mayors in decades, and very active here in Detroit. And if we would start talking about Africa, and maybe you could give some parallels to Detroit, because let me show this article that you asked me to read for this stream, which just short. Why is Africa's geography a barrier to growth? And you talk about malaria and the tsetse fly, and numbers like GDP growth. And I'm not sure. I mean, it sounds like your thesis is saying that Africa has a lot of potential, and there's certain geographic or barriers right now, but also what would that look like, and what implications would that have, so to say, to Metro Detroit or Detroit, which is almost 90% African American, or is that if you're taking a diasporic population that runs Detroit, Michigan, that has great resources, as opposed to Africa that might struggle in terms of resources like that.
No, the purpose of this article is to elucidate geography as a barrier to African development, but some of my readers they have misinterpreted the piece to assert that I'm arguing that Africa is poor because of geography. That's not the point. There are several impediments to development in Africa. Geography is one such impediment. Another issue is corruption and what economists refer to as ethno-linguistic fragmentation. Secondly, despite geography, Africa can grow. So Rwanda's economy is improving, Botswana is a jewel. Ghana is also one of the better models. And today, many of the faster growing economies in the world are located in sub-Saharan Africa. However, of the top 30 poorest economies in the world, around 27 are also in sub-Saharan Africa. So the point of the article is not to be a determinist. I'm not saying that because of geography, Africa will always be poor, but I'm making the clear point that geography has an impact on African growth. So, for example, if weather patterns in Africa were comparable to the rest of the world, the income gap between developing countries in Africa and non African developing countries would be smaller. And then there's also the problem of the tsetse fly. Had it not been for that insect, incomes in Africa would be higher by around 30%. The tsetse fly also impeded the growth of animal driven technology and by extension mechanical technology. And modern researchers have also discovered a link between the tsetse fly and ineffective financial institutions. The tsetse fly made it harder to cooperate, create businesses, and invest in modern technologies. It also limited working years. And
Is
malaria. You may go ahead.
Well, as I know you're from Jamaica, and I mentioned I lived in New York City, and I used to read a lot of literature that I purchased off of street booksellers about Jamaica, mostly about Jewish movements, Marcus Garvey, or I think even people who claim Jewish heritage came to be in power for a period of time in Jamaica. And if you consider the Garvey type movement, where you had kind of like a Judaic return to Israel, return to Africa, but it was more a rallying call that people didn't actually want to return to Africa. They just wanted a cohesive group strategy in diaspora. And, think like Detroit, where you say a lot of those barriers like language, all African Americans in Detroit speak English. And if you have a rallying factor like that as a group strategy that is not the same geographic boundaries economically, or even saying that what does it look like a natural economic group strategy to develop Africa, as opposed to something like Jamaica, where you might have a certain form of self-rule, or even as I've mentioned that you're taking upon a Judaic character to form the group cohesiveness of the self-rule.
All right. So Marcus Garvey, when he argued that blacks should return to Africa, he was specifically referring to educated blacks who had value to contribute. So the return to Africa narrative is more psychological than physical or pragmatic. Secondly, your point in relation to group evolutionary strategy is compelling, and you have been referring to group evolutionary strategy since the start of the program. So let's talk about it for a bit. The truth is that ethnocentric groups will outcompete groups that are less ethnocentric. So, for example, Garvey was not a racist. He did not believe in judging people based on race, but his philosophy refers to race first. In other words, black businesses should support and mentor smaller businesses in order to carve out an economic niche. In reality, black people are more likely to marry to other black people. Asians are also more likely to marry Asians. And even in countries like Jamaica, the ethnic minorities create their own businesses and they intermarry within smaller circles. So, group evolutionary strategy is quite significant in the black community. It has been less successful because when blacks purport the argument, they often refer to race. And whenever black people talk about race, this elicits controversy because of the linkage between black nationalism and anti-white racism and the history of the Black Panther movement. But one can be a black nationalist without being a racist. Garvey was just simply saying black people organize, unite, and dominate the economic realm. Garvey wanted Africa to create great empires like Europe, and in this sense, Garvey is quite Eurocentric. Garvey was pro Christianity, he read the church fathers, and was also a big fan of Aristotle. Group evolutionary strategy can work for the black community. We have seen the success of this strategy in Asian communities and in Jewish communities. But for blacks to truly achieve, we need a greater level of seriousness. So, for example, creating black empowerment zones is different from saying that white people are not invited in our communities. So one can be a black nationalist, but he must be smart. As a nationalist, you should also aim to partner with non-white groups because white people blacks relative to whites and Jews have less power. So in order for blacks to enhance their influence, they need partners in other communities. So this is one of the reasons for the failure of the black group evolutionary strategy.
What yeah, I live in Southfield, Michigan, which I tell people from I've heard is one of the wealthiest so say Black African communities in the whole world, and I think it's top three in America. You mentioned that like in Africa, there is nothing really comparable to what here in Southfield, Michigan, where you have miles and miles of single family houses with paved roads and infrastructure and employment and doctors and college educated people, maybe like in Atlanta and a few other places around the country. You also have such a phenomenon where you have a success of Africans in America that isn't really parallel to Africa. I mean, my understanding, even Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria, there is no such phenomenon as just miles and miles of single family houses of people living at a certain economic level in a cohesive way. And we mentioned like Jamaica, Haiti, Barbados, where the people are largely of African descent, but still have a self rule. So, that it's no longer in Africa, but such as say a group strategy where people from Africa come together and recognize it's in their benefit to organize as a group. And here in Metro Detroit, and obviously Southfield as opposed to Detroit, Southfield is one of the wealthiest African diaspora communities in the whole world, as opposed to Detroit. Has a substantial amount of poverty, and that might be related to group cohesiveness, where Detroit is almost 90% African American city council politics. Almost all levels of governments are dominated by African Americans, as opposed to Southfield's about 50% African American, and you have a lot of cooperation with different groups.
All right, so David Murray Rothbard in the 7 years ago, I can't remember the exact decade, but he had some rather enthralling opinions on the Black Power movement. Contrary to what some would assume, Murray did not have a problem with black people separating themselves. He actually argued that black Americans were under the colonization of white Americans. For example, school choice. This is an issue that's really important to black people. Corey DeAngelis of the Cato Institute and Thomas Sowell have written widely on the topic, and school choice is in favor of black students. Black students who attend charter schools usually do better than their black peers and white colleagues. So, in the context of America, I do believe that blacks must receive autonomy to create maybe mini states. I will not say a new state, but a mini state. So I don't have a problem with black separatism in principle. The issue, however, is that the black elites have a tendency to genuflect to liberal elites. So black elites are uninterested in the greater empowerment of the black community. They talk about critical race theory because CRT empowers a minority group of blacks. The average working class black person is not interested in CRT or racism. If you teach a black person that science is racist, or that objectivity is a form of white supremacy, you're consigning that black person to a realm of failure. But elite blacks are playing a different group evolutionary strategy. They have recognized that one way to succeed in the American society is to guilt elite white institutions into providing them with favors, and to do so they rehash the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. But the black establishment is uninterested in black autonomy. They want black Americans to remain under the authority of white America. And this is one reason why the group evolutionary strategy is not succeeding in the States, because on the one hand, some entrepreneurs are pro market, pro freedom, and pro black. Being pro black does not mean that you're racist. You're simply providing a different alternative. But the black intelligentsia is more interested in kowtowing to white liberals. So, for example, polls consistently show that black people want their communities to police. Defunding the police is not in favor of African Americans, according to research that was done by Fire. Furthermore, another objection to defunding the police is that BLM is not arguing that the police force should be privatized or replaced with a different reality. What BLM is saying, in essence, is that no authority should be responsible for monitoring crime in black communities. And some may argue that the police force should become like a form of welfare agency. I don't have a problem with policemen being exposed to social training, but a part of protecting the public means exercising force. A policeman cannot be too agreeable. That doesn't make any sense. So there's a disconnect between the policies and agendas of black people, the black business community, and the black elites.
I'm putting up. Are you familiar with Detroit's former police chief, James Craig, who just retired and is possibly going to run for governor?
No, I don't know much about James Craig, but I do know that many black politicians who served in New York and Detroit have not improved the conditions of black Americans.
Well, I mean, he's a Republican. I put up his picture because he's a blue-eyed man, and if interest of I do run into blue-eyed African Americans. If that had some sort of, but he's pro-gun, and I know in Detroit that the biggest issue that African Americans generally move away from the liberals on is gun control, and James Craig openly has told Detroiters to buy guns. And I mentioned, Garvey also has supporters here in Detroit, and one of their biggest issues where they differ with the leftists and probably the black intellectuals is guns. And I was living in a largely African American area. There's a lot of guns, and my area is actually very low on crime because there's very, very little tolerance for crime. And I want maybe we get more controversial if we talk about violence as a group strategy, and possibly specifically to Africans, that violence as a group strategy, or just in Detroit, a recognition of blacks. A lot of people don't like blacks in America. God forbid. A lot of people are pro segregation in various things, and from a group strategy perspective, saying that what keeps blacks and blacks communities safe is the fear that there's probably hundreds of thousands of extremely well-armed African Americans in Metro Detroit versus the African Americans, like University of Michigan, where I'm alumni from. You can't even go near the city with a gun. Can't get a gun permit. And if you go through the elite institutions, most of those people are going to be very pro gun control, as opposed to which seems I'm not sure if it's similar in areas like New York City. Obviously, has extremely strong gun control, but this issue of the gun issue, which in Detroit, even though almost African Americans almost exclusively vote Democratic, they still are anti-gun control by majority. And then maybe the more controversial concept, for like cold winter versus warm winter strategy. Obviously, African Americans excel most in athletic fields, and in if it's crime statistics or violence, and is violence, so to say, a legitimate, even if it's not legitimate from a moral, ethical, but evolutionary group strategy, is violence as a group strategy?
Okay. Violence plays an important role in the evolutionary process. This is not necessarily public knowledge, but violence indirectly can select for intelligence. Terrorism is a risk. How do you contain the risk of terrorism? Well, you need to invest in R&D and train more intelligent people. And secondly, researchers have not sufficiently studied the relationship between human intelligence and warfare. So why were the Vikings so successful in warfare? Well, on average, their organizational strategies were superior. Secondly, the Maroons in Jamaica. The Maroons in Jamaica were such a nuisance that the British had to sue for peace. We're familiar with two major Maroon wars, the War 1739 and the War 1795. The British in Jamaica could not control the threat of the Maroons. Why were the Maroons so successful? Well, the Maroons, on average, based on my research, were more intelligent. Intelligent slaves were less likely to be exported, and this has been confirmed by empirical research. The Maroons were tacticians and possessed superior organizational capabilities. So, intelligent groups will have the edge in warfare. Even in today, Maroon communities are more peaceful than Jamaica as a whole. Jamaica historically has been violent, but Maroon communities promote the rule of law and law and order. Why are the Maroons so peaceful? Because over several centuries, in order to combat the threat of the British, they had to promote conformity and conscientiousness. In other words, the Maroon ecology over time selected for rule following. So there's a big relationship between intelligence and human warfare. More intelligent groups will succeed. Now let's talk about violence as an evolutionary strategy, or the positive force of violence. Violence can produce positive effects, but the effects are often indirect. So, for example, the Holocaust was violent. After the Holocaust, we became more sensitive to Jewish issues and to the matter of oppression more broadly. But violence as a short term strategy is unsuccessful. So if you're banking on violence to promote the group interests, you're not going to succeed, because evidently violence only works as a long-term strategy. Its
I
effects
was
are
saying the opposite. That I mean, obviously, violence is an extremely good short-term strategy, but long-term, I mean, if you have a dispute with someone and then you use violence against them, God forbid, that to a certain extent is the single best short-term resolution to conflict, and it's only a long-term inclination that would say violence may not be the best strategy. And if you're looking at like warfare, so okay, Africans dominate hand-to-hand combat, MMA, boxing, even martial arts, which would be, I guess, short-term, pure hand-to-hand violence, as opposed to organized warfare that might require more intelligence, things like policing, and even if you talk about Black Lives Matter. I've read quite a few of your pieces, or the George Floyd protest here in Detroit in 1967. So the riots in Detroit is referred to as the revolution. That riots is from the, so to say, white perspective, and from the black perspective, it was a revolution. That I mean, not all blacks say that, but there's a certain element in Detroit that it was a 1967 revolution that the blacks won, and it was short-term violence that largely scared the whites out. And you think that it's a long-term strategy, as opposed to warfare and organized violence versus just unintelligent immediate violence, like God forbid what's happening in South Africa right now, which is probably a bad long-term strategy, but in the short term, violence is the most visceral, immediate way to deal with conflict.
Remember, because of the context of racism and stronger anti-black sentiments, violence as a tool will contaminate support for black people. I think that the best way for blacks to advance is to propose a libertarian economic strategy. And I'm not saying this just because I'm a libertarian, but economic freedom is a better predictor of development and wealth than even political freedom. So for blacks to have any form of power, they need economic freedom aided by intellectual freedom. But violence, CRT, and other sensational policies will not allow blacks to attain the respect of the wider community. Blacks can a feasible short-term strategy for blacks to succeed in America i- is to cooperate with whites by espousing some of their views. So, for example, I have observed that in America, white Americans will reward blacks if they express sentiments that are popular in the black community. So for instance, conservatism. I'm on the right because conservative philosophies and libertarian philosophies are appealing. I am not on the right to appease white people. But if a black person is a libertarian economist or a conservative economist, this is one avenue for him to boost the respect of the black community and himself. So blacks can become a real force in the American society by infiltrating institutions on the left and on the right. But it's preferable for them to infiltrate institutions on the right because right wingers tend to have more money and they're more likely to invest in the careers of blacks.
Yeah, and
So
I guess entrepreneurialism is like quite popular, and most of the African Americans I know that are on the right are usually entrepreneurial and economically are on the right, due to being an entrepreneur as opposed to African Americans that went through the academic system or that were educated or lived among mostly whites that might be more on the left, which is general economic terms. Entrepreneurs are usually right wing and people that work for the government or the systems or have high levels of education end up on the left. So you see that dichotomy in Detroit very clearly.
yeah, and David, originally I had no intention to discuss group evolutionary strategy, but I must say this: I'm a libertarian. I'm not interested in identity politics, but as a logician, I can appreciate nationalism and tribalism. If black Americans are really serious about removing the center of power by shifting it to the black community, then they must partner with conservatives on the right. Conservatives on the right have more money. They're more likely to genuflect to the demands of blacks, and their message is consistent with the black philosophy of self-help. So a black conservative is really someone who believes in economic freedom. Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, etc., are pioneers in the movement of black conservatism. Garvey conservatism is a bit deeper than that of Booker T. Washington because Garvey was a conservative in the Western intellectual tradition. For Garvey, a conservative preserve whether it be the Greco-Roman heritage history of the West or Christianity or the broader history of capitalism. For people like Du Bois and some of his descendants today, black conservatism is really an affirmation of the black church, the black family, the black community, and economic freedom. It's more financial than philosophical. But if blacks are really serious about becoming a powerful group with clout, they should partner with white conservatives because these partnerships are more beneficial and sensible. For example, if working class black students are told that they're unable to succeed in America because of racism or the idiocy of science being white supremacy, then it means that black students will be less likely to succeed. But the message of white conservatives is more empowering. In other words, it's a serious message. If you go to school, work hard, and take science and mathematics seriously, you're more likely to succeed than if you believe that the world is racist. In other words, people with a growth mindset are more powerful than those with a fixed mindset. The ideology of the left is encouraging a fixed mindset, and I do believe that though white leftists are unaware, black intellectuals prefer this negative philosophy because it diminishes the quality of black intellectuals from a working class background. If ordinary working class black people subscribe to the notion that America is racist and unkind and hates black people, then they're less likely to succeed. And as such, due to scarcity, black intellectuals on the left become more dominant. They're in demand and they can earn more money. So black intellectuals on the left want a smaller pool of black intellectuals more broadly, because if the pool begins to accelerate, then the typical black intellectual on the left is no longer a force to be reckoned with. So it's also an economic strategy.
Yes, you mentioned gender quotas, and I think that also might be related to why liberals push a certain agenda on trying to convince Black Americans that America is racist and they can't succeed. And Candace Owens and I like Kathleen Blue. I don't necessarily agree with her, but I follow some of her media, and I liked her book on white supremacy. But Candace Owens, when she testified in front of Congress, had that blow up at Kathleen Blue and mentioned that the biggest recipients of affirmative action are white women, and if it's related to gender quotas, that if it's some pressure of white women to pressure African Americans to think America is against them, and then actually it's white women that garner the biggest benefit, because you'll see more the amount of women entering positions of power is probably actually significantly higher than the number of African Americans entering positions of power. And you had mentioned gender quotas. That was one of the topics you wanted to talk about.
Yes, so this is the data. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, women in the labor force in America are now becoming more dominant than men. Most employees are actually women. According to Pew, the wages of women are rising. White women are the most protected group. White women form the most protected group in America. So for example, in the context of affirmative action, a white woman from a wealthy black background is seen as preferable than a working class white man, even though her life chances are superior. So identity politics is disproportionately benefiting middle class minorities and white women. The beneficiaries of affirmative action in the black community are actually upper to middle class blacks, not working class blacks. Middle and upper class blacks are more likely to attend university. So the beneficiaries will not be working class black students. When working class black students access university, they tend to be way smarter on average. So again, black people are being used as a tool. As Paul Gottfried likes to say, the cultural war in Western civilization is a battle between whites who love the West and whites who dislike the West, and blacks are really the tools. They're the agents carrying out the work of their fathers. Furthermore, there is not a relationship between firm profitability and gender quotas, according to the Journal of Financial Economics. In Norway, gender quotas did not improve productivity because, on average, the women were younger and had fewer years of experience. In France, gender quotas did not affect the quality of decision making, and across Europe, gender quotas resulted in prominent women serving on several boards. And there are also cases in which the existence of gender quotas has actually lowered the amount of women working in a particular profession. So gender quotas are infeasible as a strategy to promote women, but it benefits a minority, and this is why it is so frequently promoted in the media.
And just you had forwarded me this article to look at also, and actually I have a lot to say about this, but if you want to move into IQ or just show lockdown psychology and self-interest, and you're replying to a piece by Philip Bagus, and you're talking about the futility of lockdowns and the psychological implications. And I'll put up, if you could see the screen, this is from the Bragg's article, his Table 3, the state's impact on the development of mass hysteria and factors influencing the evolution of mass hysteria, and he's got the minimal state and the modern welfare state. And I had mentioned when the COVID-19 happened that it could be the start of, God forbid, bad things, and even an inclination towards more violence and war. Generally, from this mass hysteria, the rational actor theory is that when life becomes less valuable, that people are, God forbid, they're dying for nothing. They're dying for COVID-19. Here in Michigan, 1 out of 500 people have died in the last year due to this disease, that it has had a cheapening effect on the value of life. So when people are looking at some sort of calculation of risk reward, calculation of how much risk should they incorporate into their life, you're talking like the violence as a strategy, where you're saying if you have a 1 out of 500 chance of dropping dead for some virus, that people might take more risk. And it's seeing what's happened in South Africa, that could also be related. So many people just died for nothing because of this virus. So maybe it's better to risk a revolution or violence. And also, I had Dr. Dutton on my channel, and I largely agree with him about the reverse Flynn effect and the Surfside condo collapse. And I'm a civil engineer by training, and I was talking. The infrastructure in America is really bad. It almost over 50% of the infrastructure in America is past its productive use cycle, and whether we're actually going to be able to replace it, whether we could pull together, or even whether, if Dr. Dalton is right and we just are incapable, even if somehow we did all get together and wanted to work together with each other, that we might not just be as smart as we were 40 years ago, or have the productivity and the labor force to replace the infrastructure. I'm not sure if you had thoughts on that, or why you asked me to read the this article for you're talking to you today.
Oh, so okay. So what exactly is the question? Am I going to discuss the article on COVID and then talk about intelligence, or should I just talk about intelligence?
We could skip to intelligence. I just mentioned that I did read this article, and it is interesting, but it might not be enough related to the topic at hand. Just to mention that the mass hysteria of 1 out of 500 people dying this year will probably have effects moving forward in how people assess risk, and maybe in terms of crimes or revolution, or even economically, that generally the higher chance you have of dying for no good reason, people are probably going to assume higher levels of risk.
But Doooovid, do not underestimate the capacity of COVID to select for anti-intellectual traits. This is actually exceptionally serious. So, for example, in the article, I referenced the rational actor model. I've read several studies on the lockdown and on facial coverings. The National Bureau of Economic Research, Research Institute of Industrial Economics, the Journal of Clinical Investigation, Frontiers in Public Health, they all argue that lockdowns are ineffective at reducing transmissions, and facial coverings are also ineffective. If you consult Oxford, the New England Journal of Medicine, and two articles in a Journal of Internal Medicine. Though, despite the failure of lockdowns and facial coverings to stem the rise of COVID, people are rational. Most people would prefer to outsource the management of their life to the government than to do research to protect themselves from COVID. So if one has greater insight into his genetic structure, then he will determine what to eat in order to stave off COVID. But the average man is lazy. So believing in the prowess of lockdowns and facial coverings allows him to satiate his desires. In other words, instead of doing the real research to prevent COVID, he can sit down and depend on the government to save him. So that's the point of the article. You meant our rationale. We're cognitive misers. We're not going to waste resources to protect to prevent ourselves from contracting COVID when the government can do the work. And then COVID is a dangerous disease, but on average, most people will not die, and neither will they be hospitalized. So, from a cost benefit analysis, it is feasible to outsource the management of your life to the government. This is the essence of the article.
Yeah, well, what about the possible change in risk reward calculation, like, maybe Israel Palestine would be a good example. If you have like a wall, and people who try to break down the wall are being shot, then deterrence theory that you're going to obey, because if you don't obey, you risk death and extreme repercussions. That if people are have an increase of dying anyways, that the risk reward calculation will factor that in terms like revolution. That the reason God forbid, so to say, the peasants don't revolt is not because they don't want to, because they're scared of death and the hard hand of the law. But as the risk reward calculation changes and bad things, poverty, disease are affecting people, then the calculation of should we revolt might change and say, okay, well, we're going to die anyways, so we might as well die revolting.
Beautiful point. People are likely to fear social opprobrium leveled at them by their peers, and research is actually showing that those who are skeptical of anti-COVID measures are not respected by their peers. The law of government is forceful, and it can ensure that one is compliant with rules, but people are social creatures, so the force of social ostracization is actually greater than the force of government.
Well,
So I
even the
don't,
mass hysteria, like in
yeah, yeah,
with Black Lives Matter, or even what's happening in
ostracism,
South
yes,
Africa right now, at some point it's like, well, no one's going to loot or do anything like that because the force of social ostracism.
yeah,
But eventually, the mass hysteria of the crowd, or you look at like the Holocaust, or any action where there's a change and there's a shift, and at some point, enough people. I give the example the Talmud uses, King Herod, and it says that a voice came down from heaven that said, any slave that kills their master today will not be punished. And so obviously a slave doesn't want to kill their master because they're going to be punished. But if enough slaves rise up and kill their master, then they're not going to be able to be punished. And at some point, you have that, God forbid, that critical point where the ostracism for falling in line isn't there, and enough people, say like, no, I mean, this system needs to be removed. And so I'm thinking the mass hysteria to reach a level where you'd have a breakdown in society, God forbid. I don't know if we were talking about Africa. If you want to comment on South Africa as an example, if mass hysteria reaches the point where not only the threats of what the government, the hard hand of the law, could do to keep people in order, but among the peers, where all of a sudden people are like, you can't loot, you can't do these things, to having large amounts of people doing those things.
yes, yeah. Historically, social mechanism have been great deterrents against revolution, and I'm glad that you brought up the point of South Africa and Kenya. So in Kenya, the situation is a bit different, whereas we're observing the force of government in instituting rules that are deleterious for the protection of human freedoms. But Western society, on average, is more individualistic, and this is one reason why anti-lockdown protests are so popular in the West. So, for example, I live in the Caribbean. Anti-lockdown protests are not that pervasive. When people protest lockdowns in Africa, they're quickly destroyed by the state. But we have seen the situation where anti-lockdown protests in Europe, especially on average, tend to last longer than protests across the world. So because Western society is a bit different in its psychology, I do believe that Westerners are better positioned to combat the big hand of government, whereas for other societies where people are more likely to conform, it may be a bit more difficult. But COVID is not only exposing government corruption, but it is also changing the mindset of people, forcing us to select for conformity, and conformity is not always a good trait when we want to augment intelligence. So I'm more interested in the relationship between COVID and the long lasting effects of conformity.
Well, and
But
just as I mentioned, also just a mass casualty event that changes people's risk reward calculations. That a normal person in a normal circumstance that might calculate the expectation of doing things with the long term rewards over decades. When you have a mass casualty event, that it could change people's perspective in terms of long term calculations, and that would be in any society.
exactly. But David, we have been discussing COVID for a long time, and I think that you are burning to talk about intelligence. Edward Newton has also discovered an anti-Flynn effect for countries in the developing world. Michael Woodley of Mini has uncovered an anti-Flynn effect in the Western world, and Edward Newton and Michael Woodley of Mini wrote a book, At Our Wits' End. The various theories are often in conflict with each other. Some contend that intelligence is declining because of dysgenics. Less intelligent people are breeding, and because less intelligent people are passing on their genes, we're seeing a decline in intelligence. The Industrial Revolution improved the conditions of the masses, but the long-term impact of the Industrial Revolution is that it also perpetuated genes that are incompatible with intelligence, because the less intelligent are breeding. Secondly, others argue that intelligence is declining because of cultural and environmental factors. So, for example, reaction times are becoming smaller, people are easily distracted, they're reading less. I think that these arguments are more difficult to measure. So, at the present moment, I tend to invest in the dysgenic argument postulated by people like Dutton and Meany. And then there's also the environmental chemical nexus. Some argue that harmful chemicals in the West are selecting against intelligence and depleting the quality of genes. It's a very complicated issue. But what we do know is that the anti Flynn effect is evident, and the consequences will be deleterious, and the consequences are compounded by political correctness and conformity. So, for example, in the past, innovators in Britain engage in cross cultural research. One could innovate in engineering if its degree was in mathematics. Then I guess your listeners are saying, well, most engineers are mathematicians, so that's not a good example. And I do agree with them to an extent, but you get the broader point. One did not need to be trained in engineering to improve the field of engineering. This argument is posited by Anton House. He has several papers on the topic and also a book. He calls it the improving mentality. In Britain, people became accustomed to progress. They wanted to improve society, and due to their desire to create a more perfect order, they were motivated to innovate innovate by solving problems outside of a select profession. With the rise of one bureaucratization, it is more difficult for outsiders to inject ossified professions with new ideas. Secondly, political correctness and identity politics are not going away. Heather McDonald has done brilliant work on the topic. We're at a stage today in Western civilization where people can be rejected on the basis of their sex. So, for example, white men are not favored. At this point, we no longer care that the person creating the next cure for cancer is brilliant. We prefer him to be a minority, preferably a woman, and these factors are not compatible with intelligence. Intelligent people are pro-social. They have an ability to work with others, but many of them would prefer to work alone. They're also eccentric and they're low in empathy and tend to be on the autism spectrum. So, bureaucratization of academia, compounded by identity politics, will deplete intelligence. The anti-Flynn effect is being observed in the West and in the developing world. So my predictions are not favorable, especially in light of the growing prominence of political correctness. Despite the pushback, political correctness is being normalized in the West. And I think in the long term, political correctness may be a greater problem than the bureaucratization of science.
Yes, I've had you here almost an hour, and I'm not sure how much time you have. So let me mention the three major points I want to ask you your thoughts on. One thing I talk about is machine facilitated interaction. You'd be related to maybe Europe in cold winter theory versus African warm winter, warm summer climate, and that now the most important thing generally is the ability to work together with technology. I'm generally introverted, and but I'm good with machines and computers. And most important, at least economic activity, is machine facilitated, and the role of intelligence. And then I wanted to ask you your opinions on the origin of intelligence, because I'm a firm believer that intelligence arises from the soul, not the body. Although there is, some obviously genetic, nature, nurture components. And I also mentioned, I'm an alumni here in Michigan, the Roper School, which I think was the first school in America to, for so to say, gifted education, and to actually have an IQ test as the admission standards, which, in theory, had a minimum 130 IQ for admittance, and ironically was founded by students of Freud and critical theory in the Frankfurt School. And you had Charles Murray on last week or so, and I remember I was in high school. I purchased the bell curve with my own money, and at the school we had like an emergency full school assembly where this biology teacher that I believe was trained from the Frankfurt School, basically bashed Murray's book and said it was unscientific, even though the school had this 130 IQ requirement, with the theory that was founded largely by Holocaust survivors, that we needed to train the next generation of elites in order to prevent another Holocaust, or to make sure that the next generation would know what to do. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, like Anthony Storr. I remember in high school these books. They're not that academic, but his book on solitude, where he went over great personalities and great achievers, and said that solitude was one of the main attributes combined with intelligence, that most of the people who achieve these great scientific or artistic insights spent the majority of their life in solitude. And there's another book, I think Alice Miller, The Trauma of the Gifted Child. And I know you discussed this with Dutton on a few of your interviews about, is there a downside to intelligence? I remember this Kabbalist rabbi I used to study with you say that if you're so intelligent, can you get what you want? And if you define intelligence, not necessarily like a test, but intelligence is the ability to get what you want, then like King Solomon, the more one who has 100 wants 200, 200 wants 400, the more intelligent people want more things, and therefore leave this world with more desires unfulfilled, and struggle with bigger issues that maybe existential questions that might not bother. But I did take note that I do think that there is a correlation between depression or negative psychological effects and high IQ. And so I went to a school specifically that not everyone had 130 IQ or higher. Obviously, there's nepotism and favoritism, but generally, I knew substantially amount of people with relatively high IQs. So, however much time you want to discuss any of those 3 points about the role of technology and machine-facilitated human interaction, the nature of the soul and intelligence, or these points about the negative impact of high IQ.
Okay, all right. So we'll take them in strides. First point, there is a positive correlation between the adoption of industrial robots and employment. Robots obviously will cut employment in some sectors, but more rewarding work will be created in other sectors. So that's the first point. Secondly, the singularity is not on the horizon. In other words, artificial intelligence
I
will
didn't mean
go.
AI. I just meant like right now, what we're doing is machine facilitated human interaction. That maybe me and you could succeed at streamers. I'm not talking about AI. I'm just talking about
Oh,
the ability to do machine facilitated interaction or the levels of tools, like in the construction trade. Here in Metro Detroit, they've tried everything to fill construction unions, and just the nature that people need to be able to operate with tools in technology. I mean, if you want to mention AI, but I wasn't even
okay,
referring to
okay,
AI.
okay, okay. So I guess I'm jumping the gun. Sorry about that. Well, your point is quite pointed because when we talk about machine related learning, this is a broad topic. A machine is not always a sophisticated device.
I
So
said machine facilitated
yeah,
machine
machine
facilitated human
facilitated.
interaction.
Okay, so for example, even someone who is a farmer or an individual employed in a profession that is not requiring skills at the highest level can interact with machines or create machines to facilitate human learning and interaction. At the present point, I can't give. I would prefer to be able to give a specific example, but I'm not able to do so at the moment. But I do believe that you're getting my point. Anyone can create a device to augment learning or to increase interactions with machines.
You're just like using Zoom during the lockdown,
Exactly. So
switching to Zoom.
exactly my point. So we're not necessarily discussing something very sophisticated or philosophical. It's at the most basic level, right? This is what you're saying.
Yeah, and what's the role of intelligence in that? And if it's straight intelligence or a selectiveness, related to birth, that the
Yeah.
ability to get ahead is the ability to work together with the machine, and maybe that's has an inverse relationship to breeding.
Yeah.
That
Intelligence in this case is more contextual. So for example, there's a man, I don't remember his name, but he got a patent for creating a new device that's somewhat original, but he didn't attend university, he doesn't have a degree, and I don't know his IQ. So in this context, the intelligence is domain specific. So someone who is trained in a particular field and who has developed intelligence and certain competencies over a period of time will be in a better position to create such a machine than one who has an exceptionally high IQ. The person with the IQ in excess of 120 is easy to learn. It's easier for that person to learn on the job. But in terms of institutional knowledge and technical expertise, the person who has been exposed to the environment has an edge over one with an exceptionally high IQ. So in this context, the intelligence is more domain specific and contextual.
Well, I mean, like in Metro Detroit, for example, trying to fill up construction trades with largely African American population has had some success, but relatively has been somewhat of a failure in terms of construction engineering, where it's possible African Americans excel socially and even to verbal communication. But you're talking, construction needs to be done as planned, where it's not necessarily verbal communication. It's
Yeah,
here's the blueprints, and I
yeah,
need you to do it exactly as it's written, or the use of technology and protocol, which could be somewhat antisocial. Like I don't care what those guys are doing. I need you to do what the instruction booklet says, and even in terms of development in Africa, that it's largely dependent upon the application of the use of even simple technologies like construction equipment or computer, like I said, computer facilitated human interaction, where it's not like, okay, me and you agree, the computer also has to agree. So these days almost everything in financial fields, we can't just shake hands and sign a piece of paper. It has to go through the computer, and the computer also has to agree to it.
all right. So, David, this type of technical work requires high level cognitive abilities.
Well, I'm
that
talking
are
people who designed the machine, just using the machine. And you might have IQ numbers like, saying like Herman Wouk said in his, the Caine Mutiny is designed by geniuses to be ran by idiots. But, not necessarily the people who make the machine, but just the ability to use
just
the
to use
machine.
it. I get what
I mean,
you're
like you could have
saying.
an 80 IQ and probably still use an ATM machine or power equipment to a certain level. I mean, you might not be able to design an ATM machine or like an automobile, saying, I'm not sure that if they've had IQ testing, but what level of intelligence does it apply to driving an automobile, and even things like eyesight. If there's a inverse correlation between good eyesight and intelligence, to people with lower intelligence and good reaction time and eyesight might actually be better drivers or ability to use power equipment.
Yeah, I get your point. So David, Linda, I agree with Linda's Godfrey Friedsen's definition of intelligence. She argues that intelligence is not the amount of knowledge, but the ability to creatively apply such knowledge. So even though the worker may not have expertise in creating the technical device, operating a technical device also requires higher levels of cognitive abilities. So I've never done an IQ test. IQ is important, but as a little boy at at the age of 6, I read a book for children on Pan Africanism, and I had older friends, and I was once a blogger. But it wasn't until I was around, let's say, in my 20s, that I recognized that many of the people who were reading my articles were older academics and business people. So because of that experience, I tend to downplay the advantage of IQ. I usually assume that we're all just very gifted. But based on my understanding of what you're saying, requiring such a device necessitates higher cognitive ability. So based on my exposure to research and analytics and quantitative data, I may say, okay, if you're going to improve a high powered device or use it, just follow the instructions. But following instructions is not an easy task for some people. I've never studied the Detroit situation, but due to
Well,
what,
comparable to Africa, I'm saying the goal
yeah,
was to fill the construction trades with there's huge unemployment
yeah,
problems in Detroit, and there's also a huge lack of construction workers. So obviously, let's fill the construction trades with the huge
yeah,
amount of labor resources. And maybe even across Africa, if you wanted to develop Africa, you need a viable workforce that could do construction and manufacture. And if it's a relation to intelligence or strategy, that just the ability to work with tools and follow written orders as opposed
yeah.
to verbal orders, where maybe African Americans to somewhat excel in social circumstances, but for construction and mechanical things, it's not so much verbal commands. You have to be able to read prints and do things according to your written command.
Yeah, so David, originally, when I originally I assume that your question was being posed in a particular direction, but based on what you have been saying, clearly I misinterpreted it a bit. Therefore, after recant, specific domain ability can only work if your IQ is in the range from average to above average. And because of what you have been explaining to me, this form of intelligence is irritable and selected for in conditions that are greater than the physical environment. Yeah, so or I misinterpret the question. IQ in this context is extremely important because I assume that many tasks are not that difficult. I misinterpret the question, but I get what you're saying. So, for example, despite the fact that more countries have technology, incomes are actually diverging. Intelligent countries are better able to utilize technology and create spin offs. So, in this context, we're referring to IQ as we properly understand it. But as I said before, I don't know enough about blacks in Detroit or their working abilities. I've read studies on black workers in other places, but because of how you have been framing the issue, it is obvious that such jobs that may appear simple to someone with IQ in excess of 115 can be very difficult for the average worker who is more inclined to follow verbal instruction in contrast to written instruction.
Even something like masonry, even simple construction jobs, let alone skilled ones that like union, like
Yeah.
steel, and in terms of what you mentioned about development in Africa, presumably the most important thing to development in Africa is construction labor force, and even in Africa they have a lot of Chinese people that might temporarily do those jobs. And is it possible to have a foreign labor force lay the infrastructure? And then even here in Southfield, Michigan, it was largely a former white community that almost all the houses here at some were built by mostly whites and lived in by whites, and then the whites had largely moved out, so you have a wealthy African American community with miles and miles of single family houses and good infrastructure, but it was, so to say, built and to some extent maintained by a foreign labor force. You mentioned like an Africa group cooperation. That is it possible Africa could develop? Saying in certain countries, are you going to be able to turn 10% of their population into a productive construction, manufacturing labor force? And if not, can you, like Nigeria or other countries that have obtained a certain amount of wealth, to have foreign laborers come in and
Yeah.
lay the infrastructure and maintain the infrastructure?
Doovid, this is a problem. For R&D investments to be profitable, IQ should be in excess of 90. There's a positive relationship between IQ and the growth of nations. Jamaica, the IQ of Jamaica is 75.08, and this level represents mental instability. It's not retarded, but people with IQ in this range are not the most pleasant individuals to deal with under stressful circumstances. So for instance, in Jamaica, it is often said one person of Chinese stock can do the work of five Jamaicans, and it is largely true. From 1972 to 2007, Jamaica's productivity rate declined, and there's often a preference for foreign laborers. So Jamaica is adept at attracting foreign direct investment, but inept at keeping it, because we just do not have the labor force that can encourage high-powered executive to create businesses in Jamaica. So if IQ is not fixed. IQ can be improved. There are over 500 genes that are directly related to IQ, but IQ is also working in tandem with personalities, and personality is heritable, and as such, some groups may not only have lower IQs on average, but they are also inheriting personality traits that are antithetical to educational attainment. So this is a very complicated issue.
Well, this the second point I wanted to make sure to get your opinion on is the nature of the soul, because I believe you are a believer, and do you believe that we have souls?
Yeah, I'm a religious person. I'm Christian.
So there's differences among believers, but from my belief pattern, is intelligence is a function of the soul, not the body. And like I know the research, I know the genetics, but when I look at it, I would say that essentially intelligence is a function of the soul, not the body. Talmud gives an example of the person who had to be taught something 400 times till they got it. And as someone who's coached chess, you've noticed that hard work does pay off, and that people even 70, 80 IQ could reach a level of chess where they will beat an intelligent adult. Maybe we could talk a different time too much about the science of expertise. But I mentioned to you in the Twitter this famous, I think he passed away last year, Erickson, and the 10,000 hours of to reach expertise. But there's substantial research that expertise is more related to this 10,000 hour rule. 10,000 hour rule has been debunked, but more to intelligence, and that there's a learning curve, and people of higher intelligence will have gains quicker in the beginning, but over a long period of time, that it's more expertise, and but we could save that. But what is your nature, the origin of intelligence? And as a person who believes in a soul, do you not believe intelligence? Where does intelligence arise from?
Yes, so I'm going to speak on the origins of intelligence quickly. There's the cold winters hypothesis postulated by people like Richard Lynn and the late Donald Templer, and they argue that cold winters select for increased cognitive ability and delayed gratification. There is a stronger link between delayed gratification planning and cold winters than intelligence in mainstream research. Secondly, the Eskimos live in a cold environment. They have larger brains to accommodate certain activities. However, Eskimos do not have exceptionally high IQs. The response the response to this objection is that the Eskimos, they have a smaller population, and because of size, the genes that are responsible for intelligence are not being rapidly perpetuated. This is the opinion of Edward Miller. Another view is that for the cold winter theory to work, in the winters must be cold. Therefore, if the environment is consistently cold, then the cold winters hypothesis has a less significant impact. People also people also link intelligence to proximity to Africa. So Africa represents the origin of humanity. Therefore, distance from Africa is correlated to intelligence, because when we migrate from Africa, we are exposed to novel situations, and in order to solve these problems, we must develop intelligence. This is one view. And then there are others linking intelligence to evolutionary developments in the Pleistocene and Holocene eras. Personally, I'm more fond of the cold winters perspective because of the strong linkage between delayed gratification and cold winters, but I do believe that the research should be refined. Secondly, in relation to the issue of the soul is separate from the body. It is a spiritual entity. So the if we're being serious, the soul actually has deeper metaphysical and scientific intelligence than the human body, because when you're a soul, you're exposed to beliefs and doctrines that transcend the existence of humanity. You're in a different space. So this is how
Remember the
I
metaphysics,
yeah.
the soul is the controller, like a Platonic model where the soul is a separate controller of the body. And then, from a typical model, that if the soul is the controller that has some sort of oversight in decisions and controlling the body, the role of thought does thought occur on the physical realm, like the heart problem, the consciousness in the brain, or is thought not occurring on the physical realm and is occurring on the controller realm of the soul?
It occurs with both, but my understanding of the soul is a bit different from other people. I view the soul as a metaphysical essence. So as an individual, our earthly intelligence is distinct from our spiritual intelligence. The soul has a different intelligence, and when we die, the soul exists as a separate body, and the intelligence of the soul is further illuminated. But the intelligence of the soul when we are living does not affect our phenotypic or genotypic intelligence.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
do you look at the soul as having a controlling power that, say I'm talking to Lipton Matthews, and there's a physical genetic component, and then there's the soul component,
Yeah.
and what effect is the soul having in the decisions that you're making? Does the soul have the power to control your body?
The soul influence our decision in the spiritual realm, and secondly, it functions as a sixth sense. So for example, I am going to the supermarket, but then a mind may say, don't go to the supermarket today, go to the supermarket tomorrow. And then today I decided to stay home, and a gunman went to the supermarket and he fired 10 shots and 2 people died. So my concept of the soul is more spiritual than intelligence in how we normally perceive it. I don't view the soul as this entity that's directly telling us what to do. We can choose whether or not we're going to listen to this sixth sense.
We've had the heart problem of consciousness, which
Yeah.
remains somewhat a mystery. You think will have a material and that it will eventually be discovered and scientifically laid out how thought arises from the brain.
Yes, and I think a good people for this era of research could be David Pfeiffer and Michael Woodley of Mini. They have done some studies on psychics and the heritability of psychic traits. So I think that they are the right people to take up this mantle.
Because I am a chess player and I string chess, and I play in a league with Nigerians, and Nigerians are exceptionally good at chess relatively. Like, I'm in a league, and Nigeria is one of the top 5 competitive countries in chess. And I know maybe you saw the UN's article about Scrabble, where Nigerians have even became dominant to some level, or at least recognized on a world level of Scrabble performance. And the IQ estimates you would say that that's impossible. And I mean, some of the chess studies say, okay, well, chess doesn't actually require high levels of intelligence, like the autist. I guess if you ever seen the calendar trick, where an autist could sometimes tell you tell them your birthday, and they'll tell you what day of the week. And even people with 60 IQs could do that, and they say because it's actually not that complicated to do, and just by chunking or long-term training. And so to say that high levels of chess mastery or Scrabble mastery doesn't actually obtain a high IQ. Do you have thoughts on that, or are you familiar with the high performance of Nigerians
Yes,
in
yes, I am.
international gaming?
Yeah, in Scrabble, I am familiar with the high performance of Nigerians, in particularly the Igbo. So, this is my question to you, David. Are the Igbos overrepresented in chess?
Well, they're not. Yeah, I'm saying relatively that. Yeah, I would say that. I mean, I don't know enough about Nigeria to
Yeah, yeah.
divide them, but I'd say, like, yeah, if you looked at like countries even in Eastern Europe or the Middle East, that Nigerians as a team perform better than a lot of white countries, and as a competitive nature. I don't say that they're producing world champions, or that kind of like the level where Jews maybe have dominated, but yes, that Nigerians as competitive in gaming, intellectual gaming sports, outperform many nations in open intellectual competition.
Yeah, Nigeria, in a sense, is the intellectual leader of West Africa, and I argue that the Igbos are intelligent on two accounts. One, higher levels of exogamy and migration. The population pressures in Igbo land force them to migrate, and as a result, they are to confront novel situations. Secondly, when you are expected to marry outside of the immediate tribe, you are automatically exposed to foreign cultures, and to succeed one would have to immerse himself into a new culture, and this requires intelligence to be successful. So the Igbos are highly intelligent. The IQ of Nigeria is not quite high, but there could be environmental factors selecting against intelligence in Nigeria. I think this is an era for future research.
It was just in the news today. I don't know if you had any comment. This popular Israeli Zionist streamer called Rudy Rockman, who talked about Jews around the world, went to Africa, and he met with I forget the name of one of the Igbo kings, and gave him a handwritten Torah scroll of Moses, and him and his delegation were arrested for possibly trying to incite a revolution by the Nigerian authorities, that you thought the Judeo movement of Igbos is actually a revolutionary movement. So now there's 3 Israelis in Nigerian prison now
But
that
that's but
Jewish activists are trying to help free, and they're claiming like, no, we weren't trying to.
yeah, exactly. That's not revolutionary. He's
Well,
extending a kind gesture to the Igbo, because for a long time the Igbos have claimed Jewish ancestry, and there is a writer from Africa who seems to be making headways in this era of research. Based on the mainstream data, the Igbos could not be Jews, but we never know. Maybe in the next 10 years there could be serious evidence pointing to some relationship between the Igbos and the Jews, but Jewish activists are only extending a kind gesture to Nigerians who identify with Jewish culture. That's not revolutionary.
I got actually at the very beginning. I got a $2 super chat from Brakir, who I see on alt-right channels. So I'm not sure if he's one of my regular followers. Ricardo Williams, who was actually a blue-eyed man who uses blackface for his streaming now, and was part of the alt-right crew. Actually has a high IQ, tested over 140 on one of these internet tested. You gave me $5 to ask you, does Lipton prefer his iced tea sweetened or unsweetened? I wasn't going to read it, but
Oh God, these silly questions. No, I don't drink tea.
He even paid me $5 to do that to you.
Yeah, I don't drink tea. Sorry, I'm not a tea person.
What do you think about the blackface? Because you've talked with a lot of so to say infamous personalities.
Yes,
and
yes.
So this man who related back to the Mises Institute, where libertarians maybe had a leaning to be anti-immigration or worry about certain demographics, where my libertarianism doesn't really worry about demographic changes. But does this man using blackface? Do you have any comments on that?
On blackface?
Well, I mean saying that this alt-right, so to say, activist, blue-eyed man using blackface for his streaming.
Okay, so let me be very succinct. I'm not an emotional person. Blackface served a purpose historically in the acting industry. Some find blackface offensive, but it's neither here nor there to me, David. I'm not very emotional. Secondly, libertarians, Mises, and the alt-right. Murray Rothbard was not a racist. Lou Rockwell is not a racist. Murray Rothbard was an anarcho-capitalist. And if you understand anarcho-capitalism properly, then immigration is a matter of private property rights. In a truly libertarian society, all property is privately owned. Therefore, immigration cannot be a right, because to immigrate, you would need the permission of the property owner. So within this context, open border immigration is quite infeasible. Secondly, I have written a piece on the topic. I sent it elsewhere. I won't tell you the publication that carried it, but my argument is quite simple. I'm a libertarian. I also subscribe to the anarcho-capitalist views of Murray Rothbard, but I'm also a realist. And the state exists. Libertarians want to abolish the state, but for the present time, the state exists, and it is very hard to upend the state. The state, like other corporate entities, has the right to self-determination. So, for example, if I start John Brown Mechanical Company and I say my CEO should have a PhD, then my CEO will be required to have a PhD, because the state is a free entity with the right to discriminate. If open borders again is infeasible, the state must discriminate in favor of its citizens. The citizens are the taxpayers. They have a right. So citizens can say, we prefer engineers to migrate to America, or maybe we may need more doctors. But the concept of open borders is utter nonsense. And I'm speaking for me and some of the older fans of Mises, but not the current Mises establishment. So, for example, Walter Block is a fan of open borders, and Herman Hoppe is not a fan of immigration.
So let me just, I've had you almost 2 hours. I appreciate your time. Oswald, this man who uses the name Oswald Sprengler, who actually referred me to your channel, wanted your opinion on Calvinism. Ricardo dropping another $5. I have Luke Ford live streams, and I saw you had Colin Lindell on your channel. He said Luke Ford has some of the best content on YouTube, and I mentioned Luke Ford would that I was going to have you on. He actually personally donated my microphone and camera. He's a convert to Orthodox Judaism that's been following different issues, but he would love to have you on his show also. And I'll read Ricardo's $4.99 super chat. Can Lipton comment on CRT and Rufo's war against it? Has he heard of Curtis Yarvin's critique of Rufo? What can we do to fight back?
All right, so let me. I am familiar with Curtis Yarvin. I have not read his critique of Christopher Rufo, so I can go and look it up now. So I'll do that, but I will talk and look it up at the same time.
You want to
Uh,
comment on your thoughts on Calvin?
Calvin is.
And,
Oh, let me
and
talk about.
Luke Ford said he's going to reach out to you.
Yeah, so my email is low_matthews@yahoo.com. It's not.
I'll message that to him.
Yeah, that yeah. So you can send me a mail at any time. But on Calvinism. On Calvin. Who was Calvin? Calvin was a brilliant legal mind, an astute philosopher, a defender of individual freedom on one hand, but a draconian enforcer of his own philosophies on the other hand. Do I like Calvinism? Yes, I'm a follower of Calvin to an extent because I view success as evidence of God's favor. If you are a creature created by God, you must be rational, you must be successful, and you must be wealthy. So I like Calvinism, but at the same time, the broader Protestant movement is a bit anti-hierarchical, anti-philosophical, and anti-rationalist. The medieval scholastics were actually more rational than the Protestants. The medieval scholastics would debate the nature of God, the nature of angels, and though this is not public knowledge, but according to Edward Grant, it was not popular during the medieval ages to invoke religious belief when discussing natural philosophy. The Protestants tend to take the Bible a bit literally. I view the Bible as a philosophical and ethical tome providing guidelines as to how we should live. So all biblical stories could be untrue, yet God is real. I'm a rationalist, so I tend to support the cause of the medieval scholastics, but I do like Calvin and success. Success is favor and evidence of God work. That's why I view success. If you're a Christian, you should strive for success. The Bible does not like lazy people. A man who doesn't work shouldn't eat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's charitable nature, I mean, saying that the goal for myself, but to mercy and compassion and judge people favorably. I mean, the Talmud has the famous, says, I'm not familiar with Rufo's war, but the Talmud mentions Rufus, the evil Roman who asked Rabbi Akiva, if God is so just, why did God create so many poor people? To which Rabbi Akiva answers, in order to save us from hell, that, God forbid, because we have, like Calvin, we have so many sins that need to be atoned for, that poor people or less fortunate people are the ability, provide us the ability to atone for our sins.
All right, so now we can discuss CRT. Doovid, CRT is not a doctrine. It is simply an anti-white screed, nothing else. Derek Bell was a brilliant mind. I don't agree with Derek Bell's view of the world because he was influenced by Marxism, but Derek Bell was exceptionally bright, and I'm guessing that some of the other early exponents of CRT were smart. Ignatieff, he was one of the first people to popularize the dislike of white people. Whiteness is conflated with problems. Ignatieff was a pioneer in that regard. But CRT is basically a waste of time. We only talk about it because of its unhealthy impact on the public education system. As for Christopher Rufo has expertise in economics. I don't tend to like characters who tweet a lot or mock CRT. If CRT is stupid, why should we mock it? We can promote an intellectual challenge, but mocking it is a bit much. I think Christopher Ruffer is on the lighter side of life. I don't necessarily view him as a defender of America or Western civilization. He wants to mock CRT activists because they're stupid.
It's funny. I told you I went to this, school that was founded, under critical theory from even to, people who had studied in Columbia from the Frankfurt school, and the alt-right 2016, somewhat in a counter-Semitic way, was warning about critical theory in the Frankfurt school, and I guess 2016, the critical race theory wasn't even that much on the map, and it was on the map, but it hadn't became dominant, and when I was in high school, we talked about critical theory is more like Margaret Mead and cultural relativism.
Yes.
and now it's became dominant, to the point where critical race theory and even the big names in critical race theory, it's more the opponents of it that draw the connection to the Frankfurt school, as opposed to if you have a spin-off of critical race theory. That do you think critical race theory is a direct inheritor descendant of critical theory, or is it became
Okay.
its
So
own?
the Frankfurt School oppose the ethos of Western civilization because you cannot destroy capitalism without annihilating its philosophical framework. So the critical race theory is an object or a byproduct of the Frankfurt School, because critical race theory is criticizing a meta narrative. The meta narrative is that America is an established nation founded on liberalism and racial equality. But the original critical theorists are smarter than the present coterie of CRT activists, both the critics and the exponents. So no, I wouldn't classify CRT as a direct product of the earlier Frankfurt School people like Marcuse. Remember, guys like Marcuse and Adorno had a broader philosophical picture. They wanted to understand the essence of capitalism, what energized capitalism, how to modify it, or maybe we should get rid of it. That was their aim.
We got it here in the chat saying when social fear disappears, so
Well,
does racism. I mean, do you agree with sentiment like that? Or you think racism, just natural pattern recognition, racism will always exist, or is there some sort of way to dissipate it?
Well, let me continue. Herbert Marcuse, possibly he's the closest to the possibly Herbert Marcuse is closest to being the godfather of CRT, because Herbert Marcuse believed in the alliance across race and gender. So Marcuse, in a sense, promoted an earlier form of identity politics, but modern identity politics is anti-Marxist because it is de- de- destroying social capital. We're no longer cooperating to destroy the capitalists. We want to get rid of the white man. So a white working class person does not have solidarity with other white working class men. He's anti-white, even though white working class men and women may have more in common with their working class peers than with white billionaires. So look, CRT lost its. Well, I will not say that CRT lost its way. It's not an incoherent philosophy. It is just really stupid and not worth my time.
Okay, I mean, just as uses or over exaggeration from the intellectual framework and background, and even things like intersectionalism are powerful intellectual theories, but in practice, how they're used for mass media or political gain is rather anti-intellectual.
Yeah, so for example, the concept of double burden did not develop with Kimberly Crenshaw. Du Bois wrote on double consciousness. If America, let's say for example, in 1850, America was more racist, so therefore a black woman experienced a double burden, being a woman and being black. But CRT has become like an infant. It is just too unserious for me to even bother to analyze. So if some of the premises are good, because of the media and how it has been caricaturized in the public space, it is just not worth my time.
Okay, and great. And Ricardo, he's a high IQ man. He knows how to make that money. Drop another $5 for your views on monarchy, maybe even relate to Africa. Is Africa better off going a democratic path or a monarchy? And before you leave, I want you to tell people about your plans for creating your own media network, and I'd be honored to be part of that in any way.
All right. Okay. So who is Greg? What's Greg's name? You said something about Greg and IIQ.
No, this guy. I mean, he's using a blackface. He calls himself Ricardo Williams, but he's a blue-eyed man, and he's high IQ and saying he's high earning. The reason he doesn't want to give out his name is because it could affect his employment. But he was asking he's an alt-right personality. and he's asking your opinion on monarchy, and I attached it to the question that we talked about
All right.
Africa. Like, is Africa better off going the direction of monarchy or
All right,
liberal?
I love that question. So this is what the data and studies tell us. Monarchy is a strong predictor of protection for property rights, and for obvious reasons. The monarchist will ensure that his children or descendants have a country that's worth investing in. So the monarch is less likely to appropriate resources from the elite. This has been postulated by scholars like Hans Hermann Opp. Eric von Leden was also a fond follower of monarchy, but empirical research has confirmed their assertions. There's also a positive link between development and hereditary rule. A monarchy is like a private government, and when you are an entrepreneur, you want your asset to appreciate over time. So monarchy is a better predictor of development in some cases than democracy. Secondly, the monarchy is the guardian of culture and social capital. During reform periods, people are more supportive of the government when a monarchy exists because the monarch represents long-term continuity. Monarchs have an edge because of their role in promoting cultural symbolism. Should Africa adopt monarchies? There is a positive relationship between state centralization and modern development in Africa. Regions in the past with states and monarchies tend to be better off today, and by region we're literally referring to communities or what we call a parish or a county. And based on the trajectory of development in Africa, presidents have not done as well. So for Africa, I would suggest a constitutional monarchy. But then Swaziland, well, the Swaziland monarch does not operate like a constitutional monarchy. That's an absolute monarchy. But I would recommend a constitutional monarchy for African countries with a longer history of monarchies.
Yeah, so I've been following your YouTube channel now for about a month, watching all your content, great interviews, all types of your personalities, a lot of serious academics, and even some big names. You have Kaufman and Murray. Maybe at some point, if you could look into the science of expertise, because I think there's a divergence between intelligence and expertise. And I mentioned like Erickson, who passed away in the 10,000 hour rule. And there's a lot of studies of why expertise isn't transferable, because most that if you're expert at one thing, that you can't just become an expert at something else. You usually have to go through the process. But yeah, I'd be interested in talking with you again about that, or just if you had more content related. I think, as you talk a lot about intelligence, and I think expertise.
Okay. So Doovid, G refers to specific cognitive ability. If you are adept at economics, more than likely you're going to be good at physics. If you like English, you may also be a good mathematician. So, for example, during high school, I liked English. I did not like mathematics because at the time it seemed inapplicable, and I was better at predicting the answer than actually working out the problem. So when I got my grades for mathematics, they weren't usually good, because in mathematics one has to follow a logical process, and at that time I was not very serious about economics or quantitative studies or statistics, so I was basically a C student. But I passed my exams anyway. The point of the story is this: if you're good at one area, you will be good at another area. Skills can be transferred, so an expert in engineering can become a top-notch surgeon.
Well, evidence doesn't show that. I'm saying that I mean, not like, I mean, there is obviously some transferability, but no, like you would have to go through the process. If
you'd have to be trained. You'd have to be trained.
Economics, where calculus. Okay, if you understand calculus, and calculus is the basis for all of these skills, and maybe like someone who might take 10 years, to that training, it still takes you 2 years. It's not like you could be the world's smartest physicist, and then switch to economics. It's still, if it took the average guy 10 years, it'd still take him 2 years.
Yeah, but you'd have to be trained.
There's a science and studies in this, and saying that the transferability of expertise is assumed to be much higher than it actually is.
Yeah, but you'd have to be trained, David. But if you're an intelligent person in one era, you will do well in other areas. You may not do as well as your original profession, but you will do well. And historically, innovators were not always linked to their select professions.
Yeah, so I'm that's one of my main areas of focus. The science of expertise, and I think even more so than intelligence. And obviously, intelligence might be the single most important factor in expertise. But kind of the nature nurture debate, because there are low intelligent people that reach expertise, and there are intelligent people that fail. So in terms of the nature nurture debate, like I'm a chess player also, and historically chess is probably the single most studied field, even in terms of intelligence and expertise. That one of the biggest problems for people is the fact that they're grandmasters and world caliber chess players that only have average intelligence. And in terms even the articles, I guess, on medical, I think it's an important topic to cover, the role of intelligence and expertise. That certainly you're interviewing big names, that be an interesting topic to delve more into.
Yeah, and this may be our last point. So, John Freeman has a book on the curse of giftedness. Gifted people have higher standards than the less intelligent. So, this is one of the reasons why they're more likely to suffer from depression and other developmental challenges.
Yeah, I mentioned as a kid I'd read Alice Miller's The
Yeah,
Trauma of
Alice
the Gifted
Miller, yes.
Child, and that one's already a dated book. Um,
But
and
John Freeman book is not quite dated. And back to the issue of silence. Susan Kane has a book corroborated the assertion of that scholar you referred to earlier.
Anthony
Did
Storr, Solitude.
yes, the Allen. What's his name again?
Anthony Storr.
Yeah, Anthony Storr. Yes, solitude is important. Our best ideas emerge during periods of boredom when we are alone, and many philosophical leaders were actually extroverts. So it's an interesting line of research.
Yeah. Did you want to mention your plans or
Oh yes, oh yes.
for?
So I'm all right. So some academics are willing to upload their videos to my channel, and you have sent me some videos and I will upload them soon. But if you are an academic, feel free to send me a Zoom link and I will upload the video to my channel. Why am I doing this? One, to promote academics, and two, in the long term, to create the Huff Post for academics online. And I intend to pay them, but not at this point. A we're working on an IT platform to ensure that academics will be in a position to pay themselves, so they don't need to require on us for payment. But this is one way to combat cancel culture and political correctness. At the present moment, I have over 700 subscribers. Therefore, I am obscure, so I can leverage my obscurity to attract big names and engage in fascinating discussions.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate you accepting my invite, and maybe if it's possible, even have you back at some point to talk about expertise or other issues. And definitely, I've been watching all of your content, like the last month, and follow your content regularly.
Yeah, and I had Razib Khan on the show recently, and Diego Coleman. I had them this week on Monday.
Yeah, I watch those.
Yeah,
I watch things all in two speed. Um, because
yeah,
time is short, and I have a year of master's school. I consider myself an academic. I studied in yeshiva and Talmudic Academy almost 5 years. But I'm not really a qualified academic. Versus the role of going through the process and getting the degree. Versus someone who's intellectual, willing to do the hard work of reading and understanding. In fact, when I reached out to you, I mentioned speed reading, that chunking theory, and so it's
yes.
related
You mentioned
to
chunking
speed
theory.
reading. So like, I think I could outread most academics. Like I
But
love.
but 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 David, you are not. Do you have a master's degree?
I have a undergraduate degree in general studies from University of Michigan, and about a year's worth of unmatriculated master's work in civil engineering.
Okay, okay. So this is my new plan, David. public academia, if you're really exceptionally smart person with time, maybe you should just create a new journal and invite academics to publish in that journal. So, for example, Edward Dutton had a PhD in theology, I believe, but he has published articles in intelligence journals and evolutionary psychology. So, outsiders are actually producing high quality research and more productive research relative to some big names in academia. So at this point, if you're serious about academia, get a master's or a PhD or just get a bachelor's degree. Do work, invest in regression analysis if you want to study intelligent research or economics, and publish your own journals. I don't care much for mainstream journals these days. So for example, some time ago I got into a ton of really good schools in the UK, and for one reason or the other, I accepted the application, but I didn't make the trek to go to England to get a degree. And one of these schools is actually very, very good, and I didn't get in on the basis of affirmative action. But these days, I'm just building my brand, communicating with academics like Ed and Paul Gottfried and people like yourself. I don't care for mainstream validation.
Okay, well, great. Honored to have you, and look forward to the next time. Hopefully.
All right, bye.
Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.